Hey folks, welcome to Snowpal's Polyglot Software Development Podcast. Today we are joined by Daniel Mawdsley, founder of Skilled Society, a platform challenging the status quo in discovering and hiring talent. With AI-driven assessments, Daniel is reshaping how companies identify and hire the right people. Daniel, thanks so much for taking time to chat today.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
No worries. And if you could, I know I gave an introduction, but if you could introduce yourself in your own words to our audience, both about who Daniel is and then the company, a little bit about your company as well.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so I'm Daniel. My background is in UX design. My early career, UX design, a bit of HTML, CSS in terms of hobbyist kind of learning from myself and bring designs and products to life from a viewing standpoint. I have experience across agencies, internal companies as well. Agencies around marketing, market plans, going to market, building new products internally in terms of bringing new products to market or optimizing existing products. And then more recently, my career turned into moving to a startup, scaling that up to a business that's a scale up now, and we started with 8 people and now we're at 200. I previously exited that role around 12 months ago to start my own business. It's called Skill Society, to try and solve a problem that I identified when I was working at my previous role. So, that introduces kind of Skill Society there. And basically, what we're trying to do is we're trying to revolutionize the hiring process by offering AI-driven, kind of human-centered assessments, platforms designed to kind of automate and improve the effectiveness and the fairness of screening and qualifying candidates to make sure that they're objectively and consistently measured in a consistent format that align with the role, with the culture, the company specifically. And the problems we're trying to solve is around, it's very time consuming, costly. It's often subjective in terms of, and very biased as well when you think about hiring from one person to another. We're traditional methods typically lean on screening a resume, doing a keyword research, and then shortlisting a potential list of candidates, and then going through candidates manually, and then giving each candidate a call. Basically, what we're trying to do is we're trying to come in and offer a solution that removes the resume completely, and then we offer an automated screen call with an AI agent to have more of a conversational screening call, trying to automate and replicate and augment the hiring team's role with those 15-minute to 30-minute phone calls to understand who you are as an individual, soft skills, topical knowledge, what you want to achieve in the future, and ask some sort of behavioral questions as well. And based on qualifiers for each business that we work with individually, we'll then qualify each candidate based on that specific business's needs. So we're trying to solve the problem from two sides as well. That gives internal teams or recruiters a way to scale and augment their existing processes, but it also gives candidates the opportunity to put the best foot forward, have a conversation, even though it's with an AI. We lead with that and make sure it's very transparent. And the feedback we're getting is pretty amazing in terms of the opportunity that people feel like they've had, and it's quite a new technology and it's quite interesting as well. But it allows you to kind of add a voice and a fit and add some sort of attitude and identify skills and things like that, and more about you as a human rather than here's what my resume says and here's what I've done in the past. It's more around, well, who are you and what are your traits, what are your your skills, and what do you want to bring to the table versus here's what I've done.
Thanks for the introduction. That's lovely. So it's a very interesting topic. The topic that we picked for today is finding a product market fit. But before we get into the weeds of product market fit, I know you explained your company very well. I just want to sort of scratch the surface and ask you a few questions. So the idea here, just so I make sure I understood this correctly, the traditional process involves a human, a recruiter, calling, filtering a bunch of candidates, and then shortlisting them, having the initial conversation with the candidate. With your approach, Daniel, Am I understanding it correctly that that initial conversation will not be happening with a human, but that initial conversation happens between the candidate and AI essentially? Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah, yeah. We're augmenting part of that role to automate that conversation and then make an objective for qualification based on whatever the hiring manager or the hiring team is looking for in advance, so that each candidate's measured and assessed consistently.
That's great. So again, just so we get very specific there, right? So meaning, let's say there's a position open. Is this a process a client comes to you, says, Daniel and team, you need to help us fill 5 positions within 3 months or 2 months at this organization, right? Let's say located somewhere in the world. And now
Yep.
there is a human involved initially, I presume, and then they engage this AI. So when the actual conversation happens, there is a meeting that's set up, and when the two parties actually talk, one of the parties is human, and it's pretty cool. The other party is AI, and it's asking these questions to the candidate based on perhaps things that are on the candidate's profile, LinkedIn, and other places. Or if you could just speak to it, I don't want to be presumptive about it. So what is the conversation looking like? What does the first conversation look like?
Conversation typically, when we approach, customers or customers come to us with that problem, and that's exactly the scenario. They're like, we need a scale. We're hiring for 6 engineers. 6 of them are going to be overseas, or they're going to be onshore. There's going to be a mix. We're going to hire for product managers. We're going to hire for designers, or a sales role and things like that. So how it works is that I would work with you as a hiring manager or as that company to understand, well, what roles are you hiring for? What typical screening questions are you asking in each of the roles? Because what you're going to asking a front end role versus a back end versus a UX designer or a product designer or a product manager is going to be very different. It's going to be, you're going to be looking for different skills and different traits, and especially if they're going to be onshore or offshore as well. Communication might be a lot higher in terms of things that you need for a developer per se. If you're going to be working remotely, that communication is the most important skill to start with. Versus if you're onshore, you can have those conversations. You're going to be a part of the huddles. It's a lot easier to facilitate those conversations rather than online. So what we would do is we basically work with you as a hiring manager. I'm using you as an example, Krish, to create, well, what does an excellent candidate look like for this front end role? What does an okay candidate look like? And what does a candidate that just doesn't hit the mark look like? So then we can qualify and build on top of the LLM with sentiment analysis, how we identify these top quality candidates off the back of a conversation that they'll have, on demand. So every day we'll deliver an email into that person's inbox saying, here's who we screened yesterday. These are the 3 amazing candidates we found. 5 were okay, and then 20 just didn't hit the mark. So then you can focus on, well, how did that interview go, and how was that candidate assessed? Listen to the audio, get an understanding of the communication fields, how they answer different questions that you've already set up in advance, and then almost skip that screening call and just go straight to an interview. Who do you want to take to the next interview stage? And that's basically what our service is offering in terms of providing that, solving that pain point for hiring teams, and really giving a lot of time back into the hands in terms of, you don't have to chase candidates, you don't have to manually screen resumes, leaning on old systems where you're doing that kind of Boolean keyword research on an ATS system where if you're not good at writing resumes, you're not going to get in that shortlist. If you've spelt something wrong in your resume, you're not going to get in that shortlist. And it's also based on whatever the hiring team's keywords are looking for as well. And you will not know that at the end of the day as well. So we're trying to circumvent, well, a resume is an old solution to an old problem, but an existing problem. And we're trying to let's look at the human side of that, and how I, as a hiring manager, would assess somebody in front of me. I would typically look at them. If I'm hiring for a product management role, senior product manager, I'd assume a certain level of understanding and a certain level of knowledge for that person in that role. But what I'm looking for is, I'd be like, well, what's your attitude look like, and what are your skills, and how do you communication, how do you break down your thought process and your thinking, and communicate something that's quite complex to a simplified audience, for example, and then look at, well, does that person and their attitude and what they want to achieve and how they're going to fit into the holistic team, does that align with my current company goals, and does that align with what I need from this role to move it forward, rather than, okay, can you do a product manager's role? Obviously, we still need a screen for that later on in the stages with case studies, or it could be tests when it comes to developers and things like that. That would still happen, but that would happen a bit later. It would be, if you don't have those skills and those attitudes in the first round, then you probably we don't need to qualify you in terms of how well you can code or how well you can, bring, product to market, for example.
Okay, we're going to spend a couple of more minutes for me to understand a little bit more, and then we'll just have a segue into
Yeah.
the next part of this topic. So, which means you're not filtering, you're not coming up with a list of candidates before you engage this tool, correct? The tool, in other words, you mentioned that there is no resume to start out with. So, how does the tool even know that there is a candidate called Krish? Is it looking through platforms like LinkedIn to find out who's open to work, and then actually trying to set up a meeting with those candidates that are potentially open and looking at this point of time?
Yeah, so there's two approaches most companies take, and the ones that the customers that are on board today that are using, they're either inviting everybody that applies for a role or qualifying based on certain criteria. And that qualification is not around that keyword research on your resume. It's around questions that are kind of critical for that role. One example would be, if we're hiring remote first workers, a requirement would be, can you work 6 hours overlapping Australian business hours? Salary, if you're too high in that band, we'll disqualify you, or if you're too low, then we might even disqualify you because, we're not, at that right price point in terms of,
Right.
if we're looking for a mid-level person, it just doesn't matter. Do you have previous experience in this role? Just really simple qualifiers that don't negate good candidates. We're just basically looking for, of the 100% of candidates of that talent pool that have applied, which ones have the skills for the job? So which ones have done a product manager role? So 80% of them have never done it before. So do we want to interview them at all? Is a question. Some of the customers are interviewing everybody to understand. You really need to cast the net wide to understand, in your talent pool, how do we assess everyone equally and fairly? Or if you have high volume and you have 500 applications, how do we reduce that to 100, for example?
Correct.
Have those simple qualifiers to then just interview those 100 people, and then in your inbox you'll receive each screening assessment and audio based on existing processes with ATS systems, integrations with existing tools like LinkedIn, Seek, things like that.
Makes sense, right? So once this call is initiated between the human and AI, are the questions then driven? I'm presuming it's not a standard set of questions it's asking everybody, because the questions are very specific to that candidate, their experience, and also their responses. In other words, if Krish and Daniel are both interviewing for the same product management position, sure, their backgrounds are different in terms of what the experience is. And also, even if the same question were to have been asked to both those candidates by the tool, our responses would naturally be different. Does it mean that I'm assuming that the follow-up questions that the tool is asking is dependent on the answers, right? It's not like it's going through a list of questions agnostic to the answers to the previous questions, right?
Just to play that back to you, are you saying that the questions are dynamic based on that person's resume?
Two parts, right? One is dynamic based on the person's resume, but let's say if the person's, let's say coincidentally, let's also assume the same question were to have been asked to two candidates. Obviously, their responses, what are the odds that their responses are going to be identical? One would hope at least it's not identical. And when it's not identical, the tool is going to ask a different question based on the previous response, right? It's not going to ask the same question it was anyways going to ask to the two candidates to begin with, all that I'm confirmed.
Well, I mean, what we're doing is basically augmenting that screening call. So if you have a set structure of questions, the LLM and AI will run through those questions in order, and if you don't answer the question that we're trying to understand, we'll kind of circumnavigate back to that question and make sure we dig a bit deeper. The LLM's programmed to do that from our side, but if we ask the same question differently to 2 different candidates, then we won't be measuring people objectively. So we need to really make sure it's a consistent screening process that's relevant to everybody, and based on the qualifiers that we as a hiring manager are looking for. What answers are we looking for? What makes an amazing person? What makes an okay person? And what makes a person that we kind of would just automatically disqualify? Does that make sense?
No, it does. But let me ask a different question then. Given the fact that the follow-up questions by the tool are not necessarily driven by the responses from the candidates, right? At least that's what it sounds like to me. And if it's a standard list of questions, why, I'm going to play the devil's advocate here.
Mm-hmm.
Why can I not have both those candidates uh, be sent a list of questions and have them fill those, answer those questions to me? Why do I need this to be done sort of online, if you will, at real time, as opposed to having them do it offline?
Yeah, good question. And the main reason for that is around people cheating, and people avoiding actually getting an honest and truthful answer from somebody. What we're doing in this process is, because it's an interview and it's over the phone, it's online, it's done in real time. You can't then kind of research the questions and answers up front. Um, the AI will have a conversation with your answers, and it's say if I ask you, if it asks a question and you don't really answer it, it'll come back to, well, can we talk a bit more about your specific example? But if it also receives an answer that's like half-assed and it's kind of semi answered, we'll clarify, do you want to move ahead with the conversation to the next question? Because it's basically identified that you kind of not answered very well. Would you like to move on anyway? Based on
Lovely. Okay.
a conversation where I don't really know the answer, but I'm just winging it. So then it understands the difference between a person winging it versus like somebody actually giving a concrete answer um, as well.
Okay, no, that makes sense, which means at real time. So if it's asking me a coding question,
Yeah.
or any other questions, be it quantitative or subjective as well, it is able to tell in real time, right? The difference between humans and machines is the pace and the speed at which, the velocity at which
Yep.
machines can process. So at real time, it's able to tell, hey, does Krish's answer make sense? Is Krish's answer plagiarized? Is Krish's answer slightly different and honest or unique compared to every other answers I've gotten? So is it making a lot of those decisions real time with the training that it's had up until that point?
Yeah, the training happens beforehand, and then after the fact, a lot of those processes happen after the interview and the screening assessments done. So we'll do an analysis of that voice recording, transcribe it, and then build sentiment analysis back off the back of that and understand, well, what was the pacing of the conversation? Was the emotion changing as that conversation happened? And is there any indicators that this person may be cheating or using ChatGPT to answer the questions in real time? Because that's also a problem these days as well. So, and that's why I think we've gone with trying to augment that existing process into an automation format where we can simulate the same environment where if we give you a list of questions, I could quite easily Google the answers and then type them out. And then you'd be looking at plagiarism. Is this made by ChatGPT or a different
Correct.
LLM and things like that? And what we're trying to assess is the human aspect of it. We're not really trying to assess whether what you've done is 100% correct. It's around, well, where do you fit on this spectrum of knowledge and topical knowledge and skills, and what can we train on and add to you as a candidate versus your attitude might be fixed, or your sense of self, and a lot of things are harder to change. And your skills you can upskill, but if you have a certain attitude and that's always your way of doing things, then well, that's not necessarily going to work in a team environment per se. But some businesses might need those people. What we're trying to do is kind of replicate how would we assess candidates as a human, try and replicate that as an automated process versus just how can we make it simpler, if that makes sense. Yeah.
No, it certainly does. It's 20 minutes, so we're going to switch gears a tiny bit. This was a beautiful introduction. Thank you for that. Before I switch, I'm going to say just one thing. The irony here, it's kind of funny or ironical if you ask me. You want to find honesty that people shouldn't be using ChatGPT, right? An AI tool. But the funny thing is the tool that's actually finding out if the candidate is using an AI tool is actually an AI tool. So it's kind of ironical in some ways, but I get it, right? It makes sense. Now let's go to product market fit.
Yep,
Before
yep.
we dig deeper into it, before what finding uh, product market fit is, if you have to just explain to our audience what is product market fit.
Um, it's basically the series of it's like indicators that sorry, let me rephrase that. It's a series of indicators that give you an indication. I don't know if you should use that. I should phrase it that way. To understand whether the product you're bringing to market is fit for purpose for that market and that segment. Based on how it's being used, how it's being purchased. Is it recommended by other customers as well? Is it solving a real pain point? Is there alternatives? How do we fit into that whole holistic view of trying to solve this one problem for this one market? And you could look at, so a quick example would be looking at the demand. A customer's onboarding quite easily. Is the retention there? Rate there? Do we have feedback as well that's positive? Um, what's the cost of the acquisition as well? Is this scalable? Can we market this? Is this scalable to just Australia, or is it scalable globally, or is it a regional product? And then when we look at, as a product manager, when you look at market sizing and then breaking up the segmentation of which service or which product I'm bringing to market, look at the penetration rates of like, well, who are we trying to go after, and what's our potential penetration rate in that segment per se, and how much runway do we have, and what are our competitors doing, and things like that. It's kind of early indicators to understand that you're onto something here, and you have a good product, and you're trying to find the fit that's the right price, it's the right pain point, and it's ticking a few boxes, if that makes sense.
No, it does. But you said a number of things. Each of them is a broad topic in itself. I'm going to go
Yeah,
with the ones
yeah,
that actually that
yeah,
I
yeah,
remember immediately. Right. Let's start with the problem. Right. Before we go to
yeah.
product market fit. So you identify a problem that you want to set out and solve. Right. I mean, I'm talking about this because our audience is predominantly uh, technical, but it's also
Mm-hmm.
folks who are trying to start a business, run a startup, and so on and so forth. So the question is, the very first thing is you identify a problem, right? It's not a manufactured problem; it's a real problem. Either you have run into the problem yourself, or you know of someone who ran into the problem, or you read about it. However, it is that the problem manifested itself to you. You know of a real problem, correct? I mean, am I
Mm-hmm.
right? Before I keep going, is that uh, I might be stating the obvious there, Daniel, but is that a fair first thing to say, that there needs to be a real
Yeah,
problem?
yeah. There needs to be a pain point to begin with, or an identification of an opportunity, whether that's through a conversation, whether that's through your own experiences in your own role, or crossing across, looking at, well, me as a tech person versus having a conversation with a salesperson. Are there parallels across those two? And is there a way to blend, tech skills across how we identify, salespeople, or how we can ramp up salespeople, for example, and looking at different markets with different technologies, and that often obviously brings a new product to market itself. And I think the way I would approach it would be, if I've experienced this problem myself, or if I've heard about this problem from other people, from verbatim conversations, um, based on the kind of UX process, I would go and then try to understand, well, who's the market for that would have that problem? Are they an enterprise customer? Where are those people? And then have conversations to understand, is there parallels between each of these conversations? Is this pain point the same, or is it slightly different? Or does it not exist at all? Is it just one company's process that just didn't work, and then somebody else has it solved as well?
Correct,
Looking for
right?
those indicators of like, oh, well, 10 people I spoke to, all of them have the same problem. They all like time poor. They all have a certain problem with automation. They all have budget constraints. There's a problem to solve in that area. It doesn't necessarily mean there's an answer, but it means there's a consistent problem space.
Right. And I think what I also want to call out for here is, as somebody, we launched our company like about 5 years ago, and we have a few different products in production. One of the challenges that we've run into and we continue to run into is when we identify a problem, when we are more often than not genuinely convinced it's an important problem. But
Mm.
a lot of times the challenge we've had is, if you have a bunch of engineers who are able to implement just about anything you can throw at them, you actually sometimes jump the gun. I say sometimes, but I actually mean a lot of times or almost all the time. You start building the solution because you're actually, more interested in solving the problem, not because it's that problem. You're interested in solving a problem. It doesn't matter what problem it is, because that's what your brain is equipped to do. Hey, give me a problem, because that's all I need, right? I need a problem so I can write some code and bring solutions to the table. That sounded, if you'd asked me 5 years ago, 8 years ago, I would have said that's a great thing. It's a lovely skill. You have a bunch of great engineers. Having done this for a while, I can say that it's actually not a great thing. It's actually, I would say it's the opposite of being a good thing, because you are too eager to implement something. So you actually forget about whether it's important or not. How do you tell? I'm going to take a preposterously silly example. Let's say I'm a vegetarian and I like tofu. I love Chinese food and I eat tofu all the time. I like mapo tofu as one of the dishes I eat. Now,
Mhm.
let's pretend in a weird situation that there wasn't such a dish, that I needed silken tofu that was cooked in a certain fashion because I'm looking for it. Now, as an engineer, I go start preparing, learning the recipe of preparing and making mapo tofu, except I don't know if the demographic of where I'm located in has enough vegetarians. Is there a demand for tofu? Do people even like tofu? If they do,
Yep.
are they going to be eating tofu in the way I'm expecting and seeing for it to be? So, you kind of get the problem I'm trying to convey here, right, Daniel? How do you
Mhm.
separate your passion and a problem that's there, but it's not really solving world hunger of any kind, form, or shape? How do you take your problem and verify what are some things you could do? How long does it take? And what are some things you could do to sort of uh, identify the veracity of the problem that you believe that is the problem?
Yeah, I think this comes down to a kind of fundamentals where you look at the market and you're trying to understand what's the size of the market. Is there a problem in this space? Um, and I think you hit the nail on the head there. And even, we've done this in the past ourselves where we've started to develop a product that we think is going to be fit for purpose. And then we bring it to a customer and they're like, oh, yeah, just one of those capabilities is good. I don't need the rest. And then we've wasted, hours of development time. We should have not even bothered. Um, for me, it's around, well, what can we do as a minimum viable product that we can just market to somebody? It doesn't necessarily mean to be fully functional. It doesn't necessarily have to be coded. It could be a conversation. It could be a presentation. It could be a kind of interactive prototype that could just basically imitate the conversation or the process of what we're trying to build, and trying to get rich qualitative feedback from customers one at a time, and then measure the results based on here's the indications of how people would want to use this certain product, and what here's the kind of features and capabilities that they're looking for as well. I would start with that. It's really hard when it's startup is because you kind of need to bring something to market. Otherwise, we're just marketing nothing, and it's just paperwork. So it's kind of balancing. Well, what's our gut feel say about what we can bring? Here's the roadmap of the ambitious roadmap that we want to bring. But today, what's the most important? What pain point are we solving for? Can we start with that and then build on and sell the customer the journey of what would it take them along that journey ourselves and say, cool, this is where we're starting with, and we're really trying to understand and get your feedback on this pain point of this product that we brought to market to solve. But before we move forward, we want to understand how this is used and how this is implemented and what processes and services and external people are involved in this product, and kind of holistically look at the problem space before we start building bells and whistles that do all these shiny things, but they don't really bring any monetary value return to the business. Um, I think that can come later. Um, I think for me, it's always a struggle because I'm quite a visionary person where I'd look to like what we could do, and here's the potential and here's the opportunities based on my knowledge. But I've got to come all the way back down and start simple and really start with an MVP and have that conversation. And um, how do we move to the next stage, and then the next stage, and then obviously as the team grows, we can scale that up to different levels where we're getting feedback from multiple people, not just from myself as a product manager, or we can get it from sales, we can get it from customer experience, we could have an economist to look at the market and measure that as well, and then augment all that information together then to again give us an idea of, well, here's where the market is, here's the economy, here's the problem space, where is it going, and then put together some calculated bets in terms of what we should follow. So it's a very hard thing. It's not a hard and fast rule for one size fits all, but it's case by case, I'd say, and it requires qualitative feedback from customers, and specifically the customers you are speaking to and the customers you don't want to speak to make sure you can negate. All right, well, this is the segment we're looking after. Who do we not target is just as important as who we should be targeting in this market, and make sure we can refine and keep refining our target segment, our problem space, what product we're bringing to that market, and the benefits, and just kind of refinement over time. If that answers
Makes,
your question.
yep, it
Yeah.
does. So let me, you said a number of things there, all of them valid. I'm going to take two of them and then let's talk more about it. You
Yep.
mentioned minimum viable product. Let's talk about that. Let me take another preposterous example. You mentioned that you need to have something to show, right? You don't need to have all of it, not all the bells and whistles, but you need to have something to show, because I couldn't come to you, Daniel, and say, hey, Daniel, you know what? I know you have a lot of money. I have an idea. And I'm going to quote, one of the Dilbert, strips that I read from a long time ago. I'm going to not do a great job paraphrasing it, but here is the essence of it. Someone gets up and says, I have a fantastic idea. And then the other person goes, okay, do you have the money to invest in that idea? Well, the person says, no, I don't have the money. And the follow-up question is, do you have the technical know-how to implement this idea? The answer is, no, I don't have the technical know-how. And then the response would be, if you neither have the technical know-how nor the money, and all that you have is an idea, in pure economic terms, what it's called is nothing, right? And that resonates with me. It was from a long time ago, but I think it hit struck the right chord for me. And my question to you comes from there. Now, if I come to you saying, Daniel, I know you have plenty of money and you're looking to invest in something. I have an idea for a car, an electric vehicle that is going to cost less than a Tesla 3. So it's going to be like 30,000 US dollars. It actually has good range, probably as much as Tesla, and it has better acceleration than Tesla, or something ridiculous like that, right? Uh, the idea, right? The idea might be there. You're going to look at, okay, has this person done something in the past? What have they proven? And so on and so forth. But an idea without a product doesn't hold a lot of water, right? You need to see something before you can come closer. Now, that brings me to my actual question, the minimum viable product. Now, a lot of folks recognize that idea is not necessarily good enough, not unless you have a lot of contacts or you've had a lot of exits and you've built like 15 things in your career. So people trust your idea and where you're coming from. For a majority of the rest of the world, an idea is unfortunately not good enough. Now, but you want to build a minimum viable product. I cannot tell you, I can tell you, I can or cannot, or whatever the right word is, how many times I've seen a minimum viable product that actually does not prove anything, right? Because it's so minimal that it didn't prove the essence of what the product was. So I'm going to go with this Tesla as an example. If I want to build a vehicle, an electric vehicle, and I want to build a minimum viable product, what should I be building? Because if I don't have the money to build a car, I couldn't be building a scooter that's an electric scooter, because that doesn't prove the point to Daniel that Krish is capable of building a car that's an electric vehicle. Now I need to build a car, but if I built a car and I have great seats and lovely steering and the yoke and everything looks cool, but it doesn't run on electric, it runs on internal combustion engines, it defeats the purpose of my conversation with you here in that context. So neither can I build an electric scooter, nor can I build a car that's non-electric, or one that has nice seats and a steering wheel. I know these are sort of extreme examples, but the idea here I'm trying to convey is, how do you arrive at that minimum viable product? What are some of the steps that you go through? What works and what pretty much does not work?
Yeah, I think the way I kind of define it, I might not have an exact example for a Tesla competitor that's not BYD either. The way I define it is that even though I can have a conversation with you about, I've got this really good idea, and it's going to solve this pain point in this, that your business or you as an individual have, until I see you in a context where you need that product or you're using that product, the conversation's also worth nothing. Like, the idea is worth nothing, the conversation's worth nothing, because you're just talking back and forward. It's only a conversation at that point. It needs to be something tangible that a user can manipulate and utilize or envisage fitting into their daily routine or the daily problem that they would see, to then get much richer feedback, because the context in that moment is a lot it's a lot more with the mindset that this person is doing this job, or they're trying to fix this problem, or they're trying to solve this solution, and they need our software or service or our vehicle in this example to solve that pain point. And it's a hard one with a car company. I'm not really sure where you draw the line off the top of my head.
You could take a different example. Yeah, I just threw car
Yeah,
as a random example. Yep.
yeah. For me, it's around cool. Here's an MVP. Here's the most basic function um, of a product we brought to market. It has to look semi-professional in terms of solving the problem. It can't be a terrible solution where you really need an imagination to imagine how this would work and solve your problem. If it's a paper prototype and I'm trying to sell to an enterprise customer, that's not going to work very well because they're just going to be like, well, it's still an idea and a conversation. But if it's a really minimal interface where I can click around and I can see how this would work in my existing workflow and have that manipulation and have that feedback from that customer in real time, that's what I would say is a minimum viable product. Does it solve a pain point at a certain part of the process or a slice of that process? So then I can measure, well, what was the return on the effort that I put in? What are the next steps up the value chain in terms of what are the next steps the customer's following on with, or what's beforehand as well, to try and understand and validate, is the product I'm trying to bring to market solving a pain point, or do they look at it and they're like, oh, actually that's not what I'm thinking at all. So you might be having different conversations. So then that MVP is not feasible. It's not going to solve a problem at all. But if it's solving a pain point, it'll also spark the customer's attention span to be like, actually, I'm really interested in this, and I'll be really. And then from my own experience, it kind of fosters creativity, and I get a lot more richer conversations from, well, what about if this was the next step, and how would you work with this, and how does this work with your finance team, or how does this work with your retail team, for example, and how do those processes work together, and what do you need, what are your pain points as a customer? Now you see this pain point being solved from this software or this example. I think with a car, you probably need some level of prototype to be developed
Oh
to,
no,
to,
no,
to
we
prove
can forget the
to
car. I
prove you
think
can
you.
build to
No,
prove you
you.
can build a car. Yeah,
No, you've answered it. So let me dig a little bit deeper. Now, let's say
yeah.
you have a minimum viable product and you're trying to, let's say in your case, it relates to recruitment and hiring and whatnot. Now, let's say login, you're building an application. Let's keep it
Mm-hmm.
simple. Let's say the web application. Someone needs to log in and do X, Y, and Z. I'm trying to take these extremes and examples simply because sometimes you have to exaggerate the problem or the solution so it actually
100%.
makes sort of an impact
Yeah, yeah.
and it resonates with the audience in quick time. So logging in to doing it is, and there's two questions I have, two quite disconnected. The first is, do I even worry about implementing signing up and signing in because that doesn't prove anything? There's a billion sites that you can sign
Mm-hmm.
up and sign in. So should the team be spending any time implementing sign up and sign in when they actually build this first feature for the tool that you're working on? Because when you go to demo, you should do it. Or is the idea here, what, let's not even bother about security because we just want to prove our point, and the minimum viable product, we're not proving our point anymore by spending time and implementing a sign in and a sign up page.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, so it's in our own example, we build a dashboard, we build logins, we build user management and things like that. But the reality is that you don't need any of that. If you're having one-on-one conversations with a select number of customers, I think there's some Nielsen heuristics to say if you've got five of your customers, you can get 80% of the feedback from 5 people. So let's use that as an example. If I'm speaking to 5 customers at the moment about a product or process that I'm bringing to market, that could be completely mocked up manually for now to prove that a product. I don't need to build a marketing website. I don't need to build a sign funnel. I don't need to build pricing. I don't need to build an invoicing system. I don't need to build user management. All those things can come later once you have that understanding whether is the end goal of what we're trying to do solving that problem. And that could be a manual prototype that's set up for 5 individuals, or it could be set up for 1 individual, for example, where you just change the label of the norm and you kind of imitate and illustrate of how this would work. And that's how I would validate it. And then based on that principle that, cool, do they need a signing that, or are we delivering this service? So then we start building in, the core fundamentals around security and sign up and privacy and user management and things like that. But, in terms of our product, we one question would be, do we need a portal? Like, we're trying to save people time. Do we need to bring in a new service, and another portal, another app to add to their existing stack, another list of users, another password management system they need, and another system to look at while they're doing a different process? Is that adding time or is that taking time? So you could theoretically use that example there. Is there other ways we can solve that same problem? Um, can we send a text message? Can we send an email? Can it be a phone call to begin with? Can it, if I'm, I think back in, I think it was an old message. I think Amazon were doing, they were trying to illustrate, they were doing something with AI with the shopping center, and they had people in the back, like thousands of people in the background doing this work manually. Is that a starting point where, we're not even utilizing an LLM or paying for that service, and we don't have the technical know-how to build it straight away? Should we just use people in the background to illustrate that kind of, magic and automation side of the product as well? And, I think, so it's going back to, you don't need to build a full-fledged product. I think it's starting small, and then you can go even smaller than what you think. Like, I have to go twice. Here's my vision, and then I'm going to bring it down to, well, what's the minimum? With Skill Society example, I'd be like, oh, there's a dashboard, there's an email, there's an LLM service, there's an interactive, you can call on your phone, you can call on the internet. So we need a signed out portal, we need an assessment view. That's a lot already. That's a lot of MVP to just approve that. But if it could be pre-recorded conversation, here's a report, and here's how you envisage it, that could be done with Word and paper and a conversation recording tool. Off the back of that, you don't need to go into building strategy. So I think that's where, especially in the startup and changing startups, we need to really manage where we spend the resources, and time is our biggest resource in terms of, what we're losing, not necessarily money at the moment. Where should we spend our best time to get the most return as well? And not something that's never going to get used as well.
Yeah, you make a very key point there, right? I want to say it's an important point, because it might sound obvious. Sometimes it sounds a little bit more obvious to me now than it did a year ago, than it did 2 years ago or 5 years ago. I cannot tell you the number of times we've made the mistake of building a lot more than we probably should have started out to do. But here, my follow-up couple of questions are, sometimes, the more often than not, the devil is in the detail, right? Our intent is good, the heart is in the right place, but when it comes to execution, you are facing a slightly different set of challenges that you probably did not anticipate, at least to the extent that you might have run into at that point of time. So in that context, two questions. One is, let's say you want to build something to prove a point, right? You're proving this is my core. We started doing that for our project management app, like the first product that we launched. Now, we want to showcase a certain facet of project management that we were going to support through our product, but we needed a bunch of platform fundamentals for us to even situate our features on top of it, right? So it is not so much logging in, signing up, but we needed kind of a dashboard. We needed some data to be created. So the challenge was, hey, do we stub all of this out? So do we have, like in our case, we are in a NoSQL database in the context of that product. So the question that was open to us was, do we create a bunch of documents in the Mongo collection, which are hand created documents, right? Or using a script or something of the nature, but for the long story short, not created through the tool? Or do we actually, implement some of these things because it's easy enough? Not easy enough. What I mean is, it will be very difficult to create those documents exactly the way we wanted for them to be, with that specific attribution, for us to showcase what we needed to do. So one led to the other, right? Even though we wanted to actually build floor number 25 and show to the client or somebody that, hey, this is where the value is. Floors 1 through 24, it's been done dime a dozen times. It's okay. We don't care for it. That's not what we're trying to prove to you. But we found ourselves in a precarious position, and I'm sure we were not unique, that we couldn't build floor 25 unless we had the foundation and all the other floors that floor 25 was going to be built on top of. I mean, is that a reasonable problem, or am I just exaggerating the problem here?
Could you rephrase just for because there was a big answer there. I think I just needed rephrasing, just shorter.
Sure. No, the question here is, you're the client. I mean, we're trying to solve a problem. We're building something. I just said, it's a multi-story building. Let's say
Yep.
it's floor number 25. It's
Yep.
just a stupid example. I'm going to say, hey, Daniel, here is what we're doing on floor 25, and I want to prove that to you. But for us to show that to you, floor 25 cannot be dangling in thin air. So we
Yep.
needed a foundation, a structure, and we had to build all the way through 1 through 24 floors, even though that didn't help us prove anything to you, because everybody else has built those floors and we didn't intend to build those, but we couldn't find a way to build 25 without having 1 through 24. That is sort of a position we found ourselves in.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I would look at it from if that's one customer solving one problem, that's not a problem across a market problem space. That could be that one customer has a certain situation where they need floor 25 to be, I don't know, a bit wider to the west. God knows what it could be, but like I would try and imitate uh, without building the foundations, if that makes sense. I would look at, well, how can we illustrate or imitate what it would look like and to validate that. And at the end of the day, it's around, well, what a customer is going to pay. It's there's a massive wish list of things, and if you put a name and a dollar against it, if you pay for that, then depending on the stage of the business, we'll do it, or we'll be like, no, we're not going to do it. Um, I would look at, when you're talking about MongoDB and looking at setting files up versus doing it manually, I'd try and imitate it as best as possible to give you a sense of here's what a real world situation or a result would look like, and then some sort of basic manipulation on top of that to understand how that process works and to validate that as you go as well. It's very hard because it's not a one size fits all
Right.
answer. It's like, if you're trying to bring some big data to in a new and you're trying to bring a new product to market that requires big data for a specific customer that nobody else has access to that data, and that's a lot of effort and a lot of upfront work and a lot of foundational work that needs to go in just to prove that point. So it's around, well, could that be taken offline? Does that need to be be done in the cloud? Couldn't that be done in local environments where we run the data analysis with an analytics team and then bring results and then look at analysis in terms of, hey, here's the economic benefits of bringing this new big data economic index per se to market, if that answers your question.
Right. No,
Yeah.
that's good. No, the second part of my question was going to be, again, this also, like you said, there's no one size fits all, and many
Mm-hmm.
factors play a role here. And one of the factors I've seen play a role is what are the skills of the founder and the co-founder. In other words, in our case, we are an engineering team. So I'd been building software for a number of companies, big, medium, and large, for a long time. So that was the skill I brought to the table. Now, when you have that, you approach the problem maybe a little bit differently. In other words, in this example of Mongo collection, for us, it was like, stopping out and creating these fake documents in Mongo is going to be quicker, but it's not going to be a whole lot slower for us to actually write the code for it to create the real documents. We're like, let's just go ahead and do it. That attitude was driven by our skills. But let's say if you took somebody else who's a product founder, who's coming from a product management background or a non-development background, they're going to approach the problem slightly differently. So um, if that is if you agree that that is in fact true, do you see one as being better than the other? I know there's no simple answer here, but if there were a choice, I always wondered if I might have been better off sometimes if I actually were not a developer when I started the company, because I would have asked certain other questions of myself and of our team that I never found a need or the urge to ask, just because we could build it, and that may or may not have necessarily worked the best way for us. So is it better to be an engineering founder, or is it better to be a non-developerish founder for a product software startup?
That's a hard question to answer. I think you need both skills at the end of the day. Is my answer. I think when you look at it as a product or a design perspective, you need someone with a vision to kind of be like, here's an idea I've got, but I need someone to put this into place, and like it's going to turn it into a tangible, outcome at the other end. And that's where the technical kind of co-founder comes into it, where they can bring the product to market based on, if I let Alberto, for example, build, whatever he wants, we could build all these bells and whistles and, could build 20 capabilities, and only two of them solved the pain point, and then, 18 of them was wasted. Versus for me, it's, I could be like, well, here's 100, let's build 50. So I think it's around striking that balance, especially with myself and Alberto's situation, my co-founder. we really complement each other in terms of I'll have a really big vision, and so will he from his tech perspective, and then somewhere we'll meet in the middle, and then we'll realize that's still too big. We need to break it down again, and then what's the minimum viable product that we can market, and then build out. Well, here's our theory. How do we test that theory versus and solve the pain point today? I don't think one's better than the other because you need somebody to kind of spearhead speaking to customers, getting that market feedback, getting that traction, as well as something tangible being delivered on the other end. It's pointless, it's almost like as a product person, I'm trying to sell the dream. Alberto's creating the dream. And we could do it in any order, but if I sell it, Alberto's got to create it and he's got to rush behind. Versus if we build it, it might be wrong, but there's something there, and I can get people on board easily. So there's no one size fits all. It just depends. I think it's finding the right balance between how much should we do and how little should we not invest in, if that makes sense. How much should we do and how little should we not do, if that makes sense.
Right. And scoping the problem down, right? Let's talk about, for the next few minutes, scoping scalability before I have a last few closing questions for you. Scoping and scalability. And what I mean by that is you have a problem, you're solving a problem in the space of recruitment and hiring. Now, everywhere in the world, people are hiring in America, in Europe, in Australia, in South Asia, Southeast Asia. So the problem is generic enough. So there's two, again, I'm going to go with extremes. One is Daniel waking up one morning and saying, you know what? I want to solve world hunger. Everybody in the world is doing hiring and there is going to be the same problem. So I'm going to come up with a solution that solves everybody's problem, right? That's one way of doing it. The other option is, I know you mentioned you live in Sydney. You take Sydney and maybe, let's say you have downtown Sydney, or maybe there's another business district in Sydney. You're talking about, you know what? I know this problem is generic enough where everybody else could use it. But for me to validate this idea, to see if there is a product market fit of some kind whatsoever, and to test the team's abilities in creating and seeing if this can actually work, right? I mean, not just a problem and a solution. Am I capable of building this? Is my team capable of building this thing in the time and with the money and resources we have in mind? So let me just go to a couple of businesses in Sydney, in this district or downtown Sydney, and go to a couple of streets and then find a couple of potential customers and clients and build a solution for them. Now, these are extremes. There's going to be a middle ground somewhere. But if you had to pick, if I forced you to pick not the middle ground, but somewhere one way, this way or that way, but leaning in one direction, where would that be?
If I had to pick somewhere to, sorry,
I mean, if I didn't let you pick the middle ground, saying, hey, you know what, I'm just trying to make this question as difficult as possible. I'm just trying to ask you if you couldn't pick the middle, saying, hey, I'm neither going to go with Sydney and two streets in Sydney, nor am I going to solve world hunger. You might say I'm going to go with Australia, or I'm going to go with Asia Pacific or something of that kind. But what drives those? I mean, what drives those decisions, and what would you go with essentially? Where would you pick as your market here?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really good example for Skill Society where globally this is a problem. Like hiring happens all over the world to some capacity, and there's going to be different standards across. There's going to be structured ones in tech, and there's going to be unstructured ones with farmers, and it's going to be case by case and referral. Where we kind of came into this market, where we looked at hiring in general. So hiring in Australia and the current market landscape, and more specifically in Sydney, because that's who we can, face to face and meet and bring people on board as well. But what we needed to do is we needed to niche down. We could literally go to that. We could walk outside now and ask people, how do you hire? When's the last 3 times you hired someone, and what was those experiences like? Most of the time, they'll have the same answer, and it'll be a pain point that we can solve. But that's understanding there's a problem to begin with. But to solve that, we need to understand, well, is there a bigger problem in specific market segments? For example, in the tech space, there's a lot of products trying to make assessments with how well you know SQL or MongoDB or PHP or Laravel, and have these kind of generic assessments, coding tests, and things like that. There's a big space there in trying to understand and validate technical candidates' technical skills and how we'd rank them. Is there other parallels we could look at? Is there different markets we could look at? Is this a problem? it's just in tech, or is there a problem in the sales space? Is nobody hiring, no one trying to qualify people in sales? That product doesn't exist. That's an entirely new large market you could, you know, monopolize almost. Versus if you're trying to go into tech assessment specifically, it's already an accredited market, and then it's understanding how to differentiate the product as well. I'm not sure if that's answering your question, but yeah,
No,
I
I
would
just
probably niche down is what I would say
so
in
is it
terms
better
of
to start small? I mean, the obvious answer almost always sounds like you start small and then scale. But I'm not certain, or personally, I'm not convinced that that is the right approach. I was just curious to know, in this weird example or scenario I presented to you, if you would have
mm,
started with just two companies on those two streets in Sydney, or you would have looked at, hey, you know what? I'm going to solve this problem generically enough. So once I do have a solution, that works not just for Sydney, but it works for Melbourne, for Adelaide, for Bombay, for Moscow, for Washington D.C. and San Francisco as well.
yeah, I think for us I suppose the size isn't necessarily important. It's the amount of feedback that we get. So as long as if it's small, when I've got 100 people's feedback, but if I've launched it online, it's global, and I still have 100 people's feedback. Like, what's a better answer? It's still the same answer to a degree. You might need to sense check: is this a contextual problem? Is this a geographical problem for the people I've launched to in a small segment? But it's around getting the feedback and validating the idea. Um, when we came to Skill Society, I looked at this as globally. There's a problem here, there's an issue, and then locally in Australia alone, how is that problem being solved? And then more specifically, obviously, there's parallels between Australia and Sydney. It's practically the same answer, but
Right.
that could change depending on the problem space as well.
So in other words, as
So
a
I went,
product manager, do you worry about how this might scale in other parts of the world, or at this point of time, or when you started a company that actually tried to solve hiring problems in Australia, you consciously and quite intentionally choose to ignore whether this thing could potentially scale? I'm just trying to understand, is it good to worry about the rest of the world, or is it actually not good to worry about the rest of the world and be very focused on solving the problem for a smaller region?
I think it depends on the size of the market. I think when the conversations I'm having at the moment is around how much runway do you have, and could this be $1 billion industry? And that's the answer a lot of investors are looking for, is in can we get to uh, $1 billion valuation at some point based on the size of the global economy. That's the way I would look at it. So I look at you know HR tech in globally. The last time I checked was around US. It was around 29 billion, and of which I come to regionally Australia based on um, population size, and then geographical changes. 80% of HR tech is in America. So you can negate a lot of that and then bring that down again. And basically create a market sizing based on um, what I'm observing and what I've seen parallels across industries in what data I have of access to now. Um, with the idea that it could go global, right? It can go
Right.
global. I don't necessarily need to start though. Like, one of my previous conversations with a CPO was like, have you thought about incorporating in America to begin with, and starting there and then coming backwards and making it smaller? And then is that a problem I can solve today? I mean, I don't need to solve that problem today, but I can solve that in the future. And obviously, then I'll have monetary improvements over time, but like, that's not today's problem. It's around getting runs on the board locally to then look at additional markets, whether that's Asia or Europe or America, for example,
No,
to
yeah,
scale
it
that.
makes sense. Just to give you
Yeah,
context, the reason I asked that question was because, let's say Halloween is coming up, I mean, in the next month, right? The Halloween market, I could be wrong. The last I checked, I think about $12 billion or 10 to $15 billion is spent just on one day, for instance. Now, if you're trying to build a solution for Halloween, I don't need to worry about, I'm pretty sure Halloween probably is celebrated in other parts of the world. I'm not sure, but why do I have to worry about Halloween in Australia when there is $12 billion for the taking for Halloween in America, right? I just
yeah,
have to bring it down to Washington, D.C. and say, you know what? If there's $500 million being spent in the D.C. metro area on Halloween, I don't even have to worry about other parts of the world, right? The reason I bring that is with software, that's always a challenge, because if you're opening a
Mm.
restaurant, people don't even have to worry about how this thing might scale outside of that city, because that's not the top five questions that they actually have at any point of time. With founders in software, as I talk to more people, I feel like this is a question, and not everyone is exactly certain. Do I scale it? Do I build it in a scalable manner so it scales? Or do I scope it down intentionally so it may not scale today and this thing could fall apart if I have to scale this, but it's all right. Let me build, find traction, make some money. And if I have to rebuild this entire thing on a different platform in the interest of scalability, that's all right. That's completely all right. That's a good problem to have, and it's not a bad problem to have, essentially, right? So that's what I'm just trying to call out for. I know we are at the top of the hour. So, Daniel, do you have, this was a great conversation, by the way. It's me asking questions, it's the easier thing to do. Do you have any questions like for me in the context of what we've discussed so far?
Questions for you. That's actually a good question. Actually, I don't have anything specific in mind, but I think you touched upon something there where um, rebuilding is almost inevitable at some point. And I think a good question might be around um, as a technical. You know, I'm assuming you come from a technical background as a CTR. Um, what's your take on rebuilding and what repurposing, re-engineering, and let me give you an example. We built a product to market here. We spent 4 years developing it, and then in the fifth year, we identified that we want to move into an enterprise space. But to do that, our tech stack can't do that. And then we make a strategic decision to then we need to rebuild the platform. Um, how would you prioritize what to build first as a tech, founder and an engineer yourself? So then, how would we migrate customers over, and what would that
It's a
contingency plan
great,
look like? And it's a
it's a
big,
great,
it happens a lot. So
it's a
yeah,
great question. Let me take a stab at answering that, right? My answer is going to be very different from what it would have been 10 years ago, and I'll tell
yeah,
you why. I used to work for Oracle for a long time, and it's a wonderful company. I worked there many years ago, and they're still, they're like what, $400 billion company. They're not as big as like the other hyperscalers because they're into the $1 trillion now, but that doesn't make Oracle any smaller, even though people look at
yeah,
it as, oh no, it's actually pretty small. I'm like, no, it's not. And the reason I bring that as an example is I learned to build software a certain way early days in my career. You have to do everything correct. You need to plan quite a bit. You need to have every table designed. You have to be careful about every attribution, all the indices, how,
mhm,
the whole gamut of things, right? So when I try to build something small after the early days of me being a creator or a founder, if you will, I thought, you know what? That's how you should go about building software, right? That's exactly how you should do it. So I actually spent 6 weeks trying to iron out databases. I had like 75 tables designed for something that didn't have a single line of executable code running, right? Now
well,
this is a problem. And now then I realized, oh my God, you know what? What worked for a large multi-billion-dollar organization is certainly not going to work for somebody who's actually just getting started. So how do you go about doing this? And the reason I start the story there is because there is a fine line, and sometimes not so much, between over engineering and under engineering, if you will,
yeah,
right? And
yeah,
I've seen people have a strong opinion. There are developers and engineers who actually believe that there is no such thing as over engineering. You know what? I need to build this thing right. I need to do as best as I can. So even if everything else fell apart and hell broke loose, my component will stand the test of time. Now that to me is akin to, I know a neighbor who spent like $50,000 on building a deck, in our neighborhood. And
yeah,
he talks about the deck for a long, long time because he's very proud of the deck. Just to give you context, a lot of the other people spend like under $20,000. Some people spend even lesser. He
mm,
spent 2.5 times. Now I always tell him, you know what? 30 years later, given how poorly the houses are built, unfortunately, the house may not exist, but don't you worry. Your deck is going to be standing there and you'll be in great shape, right? So that to me is like an example I think of, because you only want to engineer your solutions to a point where it actually makes sense. MVP does
mm,
not, in my mind, Daniel, mean you have fewer features. MVP to me also means you have a system that is not necessarily as scalable. It's smaller. You
yeah,
don't have a system that has as good a code as possible. It's got some ugly code as well. It's got some tech debt. All of that becomes part of the MVP, because people think MVP is just a product thing, but it's not, right? To me, it's an
no,
engineering thing as well. You need
yeah,
to scale it all down so it looks intentionally ugly, But the thing is, here is where it gets tricky. If you end up having a good problem where things are going well for you, I don't know if everyone's going to have the luxury of, you know what, Daniel, you have a great solution to recruitment. Now I'm needed to scale to 300 companies or 25 different cities or 10 different markets. And if you cannot scale that in the next 6 months, I don't know if the solution would even make sense in the first place. I'm just taking a ridiculous
Mm.
example
Yeah,
here.
yeah,
What
yeah,
I'm trying to
yeah.
say here is the market doesn't give you a second chance. So, which means even though you intentionally build something that's quite ugly, you have to have a team that is able to take that apart and rebuild it and re-architect it and give you very concrete examples, right? And I think
Mm.
hopefully it helps you and the audience. I've been in many different projects where people have said, Krish, we have a monolith. I need to make this a microservice. Can we get this done? You know what? It's a standard problem, right? And for whatever reason, everyone ended up believing that going the microservice way was the best way to go, but that's not even true. That's up for debate. There are
Yeah.
sometimes your code base is not even big enough for it to be a microservice. It's so small. Your monolith is actually a microservice for a lot of the people. You actually thought it was a monolith because you thought it was very big, but unfortunately, it's not all that big, right? It's small
Mm.
enough. But I've seen teams spend so much money in taking a monolith that they thought was a monolith and breaking it into microservices, where they over engineer the heck out of the microservice, where thing that actually worked in production, I'm not even kidding, ended up not working after they made them microservices, meaning you lost the credibility that you built over the years. So I'm not
Mm.
sure if you're going in the right direction or the wrong direction. So to me, I think you need good people to build good software. That's the obvious. But even good people have to be making good decisions, which means I've made plenty of poor decisions, right? But you have to be able to wiggle out of your poor decisions. You have to find a way to do it, and whatever your skill is. Now, I have the skill, or our team has the skill to wiggle out of a poor engineering decision, but we don't have the skill to wiggle out of a poor product decision because that's not our
Mm.
core skill.
No.
So it just depends on what the strengths of the your particular team is, that you can actually build write ugly code if you have great engineers. You can have ugly UX design if you have great UX designers. It kind of seems like it's the opposite of what it's like, an oxymoron, but it's not, right? Because if you have great engineers, it's okay to write poor code. If you have great UX designers, it's okay to design it poorly because they're good enough, smart people who can get you out of that, right? But if they're not, then you couldn't do it, right? To me, that's the subjective challenge, and day in and day out, all of us run into it. I know
Mm.
you're younger, you probably done this a little bit lesser than I've done it, but it doesn't matter. The last 20 years of me building software, everything has changed about building software, right? But the core tenets of engineering somehow have not changed. If you were a good engineer 30 years ago, or you bring somebody out from the dead from like 80 years ago who was a good engineer in 1950, I can bet that he, she, or they will actually be quite fine today in 2024, right? But if they were not a
Mm.
good engineer, that's an entirely different story. I know it's a long-winded answer, but it's a topic quite passionate to me personally, because a
Mm.
lot of times I get calls saying, hey, let's rebuild this. On one side, I'm like, sure, I can charge you money and rebuild it for you. But it's almost like being a lawyer, right? Are you a lawyer who thinks that the client that you're trying to help is actually guilty, but you can
Mm.
help them out? I'm not a
Yeah.
lawyer, but if I were a lawyer, I don't know if I could help somebody who was guilty. At the client, the attorney client relationship would work very differently for me personally, but that's not to say that that is the right thing to do, right? Hopefully
Mm.
that answered some part of your question.
Yeah, yeah, I think you did. I've got a quote that I always say as well. It's like perfection starts with good enough, and that's what you're trying to find. It's trying to strike the balance between over engineering and under engineering. It's what's good for today is might not be good for tomorrow. And there's things where we've completely over engineered something, and then we've come back 2 years later, and I've looked at my own code sometimes and been like, "This is just terrible. Why did I do it to begin with?" And then to your deck analogy, it's not needed anymore. It's good. The house got demolished, so who cares? It's like it
Who
just
cares,
needed at
right?
that point in time. Just do it to your best abilities, so it doesn't fall over. Gets us to that next stage, and then when we come back to this or circle back to rebuilding, we can look at it then, and we might have a different problem and a new lens to look at.
I
Yeah,
have
so
one
I think
last question for you as your
yeah,
closing comments. This was a great conversation, but anyone watching or listening to this is going to be like, this is awesome, but this also seems difficult, which is true with every conversation I have with anybody or even with myself on these podcasts. A lot of this seems difficult to build a company, to build software, to be an entrepreneur. why do I have to go through the pain of all of this? Can I just not do any of this? And finding work is not, I'm not saying it's easy, but it's a whole lot easier, in my opinion, at
Mm.
least, than running a company. So if somebody is watching this, for people who are watching and listening to this, Daniel, if they were like, hey Daniel, what's a good reason for me to becoming an entrepreneur? Why should I do any of this and not just find employment? What would you tell them?
Good question. I think for me, it's around solving a problem. And specifically, I'm not a big fan of being a number in a business. Like, I don't want to be a part of a big bank and it's 10,000 people. Like, that doesn't really stir any emotions in me. I think, for me, what I hear with a lot of younger people is around people trying to have an impact on a business or an idea or a space. I think there's plenty of people that have ideas and just not a lot of people that execute on that and or try. And I think the bravest thing is to try, and the worst thing is not to try. Like, you don't want to be looking back in 20 years time and figuring out, oh, I should have given that a try. Maybe I'll be in a different position, but I had a nice secure job. It's a different problem. I'm foregoing uh, the convenience of a salary, ongoing, the security that comes with a job and holidays and things like that. I have to force myself to have a holiday now. With the idea that I've been given autonomy to solve a problem, and it's up to me to solve that problem. I'm not relying upon anybody else, and it's up to me to speak to people and go out of my way and have conversations with people that I don't normally connect with, and put myself out there and try and learn new skills and develop myself as a human, rather than give me a job and just give me a problem to solve and I can just do that routinely. I mean, that to me sounds quite monotonous and quite boring, and I'm looking for creativity and looking for my drive from my experiences with people and conversations with people, and bringing happiness and joy from whatever product I bring to market, and it solves a pain point. There's obviously monetary value in there because I need to eat food and and I need shelter as well. But if I can get some additional, value adds for me in terms of, I've done that. I've brought that product to market. I've had a conversation with that customer. I've been on Krishi's podcast and had a conversation that I wouldn't normally have done or never have done if I'd have sat at a job 9 to 5 and gone home and repeat till I die, basically. So
That's a
yeah.
very, very inspiring answer. And I ask this all the time to people because I want more people to be inspired, because it's difficult, but it is worth it. And I'll end this podcast, Daniel. Again, thanks for your time, with two things, right? Two things. One is, I read an article in New York Times some time ago where, I think it was
Mm.
a nurse who had asked folks on their deathbed as to what, if they had
Oh,
any
yeah.
regrets, right? If they
Yeah,
had
yeah,
any
yeah.
regrets. I think the crux of it was, I think she said that nobody ever said, I wish I had not done it. Everyone said, I wish I had done it, right? that
Yep.
that to me told me something. And the second thing I was going to say was, I'm going to quote Henry Thoreau before we end this podcast. One of my favorite quotes that's hanging right here is, the price of anything is the amount of life you exchange for it, right? And I take
Mm,
that quote very personally, because when
mm,
people call us and say, we do some managed services work as well, hey, we have a 12-month project, it's long, so would you be interested? My
mm,
usual response is, it's not so much that it's long, it's going to take 12 months of our time. Is it actually worth it, right? Do we want to do it, and is that the best use of our time? And you, I think, mentioned this at the top of the call, saying, or in the middle of the call, where it's not so much money, but it's time that is
mm.
very, very critical, because that's what we have. Money is limited too, but time is extremely limited, right?
Yeah.
uh, so so with that, I'm going to say this was beautiful. I know our topic is finding the right product fit, but typically, it is with any other topic, I want to touch upon, sort of draw a small circle around the topic, so the audience
Mm,
leaves with a certain element of learning on all facets. Before we end this, Daniel, what is one favorite dish, food of your, like you? I know you're in Sydney. I ask this of all my guests. If you have to pick one that you love eating, you could say it, and that would be it. We would just call it done with the podcast. One thing that you like to eat, and if it's a very Australian Aussie thing, you could just explain to us what it is as well.
oh, I mean, I'm so I grew up in England, but I live in Australia, and my favorite dish is either cauliflower or falafel wrap, which are Middle Eastern style. That's very different. It's non-Aussie. I like a lot of spice, a lot of flavor in my dishes, and I think growing up, I didn't really have access to those types of foods, so I think that's my favorite thing to take away. I think
It's funny
food.
you should say. It's
Yeah,
funny
yeah.
you should say that I'm vegetarian, and I love falafel and Middle Eastern food. So we had it yesterday for lunch. We actually had a falafel wrap in Washington D.C. It's all over the place, and I had one in England. We were there last time as well. England's got some fantastic food, fantastic Indian food too. You know, I live in the U.S. We have great food, but not great Indian food. Our Indian food here is like terrible, so it's a different
Same
story
here. It's the
altogether.
same here as well. So
Thank you so much, Daniel. This is awesome.
thank you.
Thank you for taking time, and I can't wait to get this published. Yeah.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you very much for your time, Christian. I really appreciate the conversation we've had as well. It's been amazing. Thank you.
No worries.